They threw her in with the rest, limp, cold, and presumed dead. But when the shovel hit something soft, it flinched. At first, no one noticed. The pit was deep, the morning fog thick, and the workers were in a rush. They'd done this before, dozens of times. The trucks arrived, the bags were dumped, and the dirt was turned. Fast, efficient, silent. But this time, silence broke. The man with the shovel froze, his hands tightening around the handle. He leaned closer, brushing away the wet soil until he saw it. Something barely breathing, caked in filth, with matted fur and eyes that wouldn't open. She was buried among carcasses, thrown away, forgotten before she ever had a name. She didn't whimper. She didn't cry. She just flinched. And somehow, that was louder than a scream. The other workers stepped back, unsure what to do. She wasn't supposed to be alive. There was no protocol for this. But one of them, a younger man who had only started the week before, dropped to his knees. He reached down, trembling, and pulled her out with both arms. Her body was soaked, her ribs visible, and yet her chest rose and fell. Barely, but it did. They didn't know her story, but the hole they were digging was about to bury the truth with her. And now that truth had a heartbeat. They took her to the nearest clinic in the back seat of a truck that still smelled like diesel and despair. The young man held her the entire ride, whispering nothing in particular. Just sound, just presence, just proof that someone was finally still there. She didn't move, not for the first hour, not for the second, but her breathing stayed steady. That was all they could ask for. At the clinic, the vet looked at her and said quietly, "It's a miracle." She weighed less than half of what she should have. Her gums were pale, her legs were stiff, and her temperature dangerously low. But it was her eyes that hurt the most to look at. Open now, just barely, staring into nothing. Like no one had ever looked back. They cleaned her gently, brushing away the dirt with soaked towels, warming her body with blankets and quiet hands. No barking, no whines, no growls. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that made people shift uncomfortably, not because it was empty, but because it was full. Full of things no one wanted to say out loud. They named her Mira, short for miracle, not because they believed in divine timing, but because they had seen what the world had almost done to her, and she had survived it anyway. Days passed. She didn't eat much. She flinched at sounds. She cowered at shoes, but she stayed. And then one morning, the tech found her not on the blanket, but sitting quietly beside the door, waiting, watching, choosing to be present. It was nothing, and it was everything. The vet took her home that night. No cages, no metal floors, just a small kitchen with warm tiles and the sound of a kettle in the distance. Mira walked in slowly, sniffed the edge of a rug, and curled into a ball beneath the table. She had lived in a pit, among the dead, but now she was being given a place to sleep without fear. She didn't bark, she didn't play, but she existed. And sometimes that's where healing begins. Not in running, not in tail wags, but in stillness that finally feels safe. It was the kind of stillness that didn't beg for attention, only permission. Permission to breathe without being punished, to exist without being erased. And Mira, in her quiet way, began asking for more of it. She would sit by the window when it rained, not flinching when thunder rolled across the sky. She would eat her meals slowly, not out of fear someone would take them, but as if she were learning what hunger really felt like, on her terms. She started walking from room to room, not pacing, not hiding, just walking, as if reclaiming space that had once never belonged to her. The woman who took her in, a retired nurse named Evelyn, never asked for anything in return. She simply left the door open. She talked to Mira the way one speaks to someone who's forgotten their own name, softly, often, with the kind of patience people rarely give to animals or to each other. And Mira listened, not with her ears but with her eyes. She began to blink more, to hold Evelyn's gaze a second longer, to sigh, those deep, guttural exhales that only come when the body starts to believe it can finally let go. Some days were harder. Mira would freeze when a broom handle fell too loudly, or if a stranger entered the home without warning. But each time, Evelyn would kneel beside her and whisper the same thing. "You're not there anymore. You're here now." And slowly that became true. Not in some dramatic transformation, not in fairy tale recovery, but in the smallest details. The wag of a tail when Evelyn opened a jar, the tilt of a head when music played, the way Mira started sleeping, belly up, spine curved against a pillow she had claimed as her own. She was not cured, she was not whole, but she was not forgotten. And in a world that had once tried to bury her, that was everything. Because she had once been a body mistaken for garbage, a breath missed by inches, a soul almost erased by silence. And now here she was, taking up space, being seen, and quietly reteaching the world how to care. Neighbors who had never visited Evelyn began stopping by, not out of curiosity, but out of awe. They'd heard the story, the dog who came from the pit, the one who didn't die when everyone assumed she had. And when they saw her, thin, quiet, eyes still tired but watching, they didn't see tragedy, they saw resilience. A local school teacher asked if her students could draw pictures of Mira's rescue. A man from a nearby shelter began printing her photo on adoption posters with the words "Every life matters." And someone, a stranger from across town, left a note at Evelyn's door one morning. No return address, just 7 words. She reminded me not to give up, because that's what she had become. Not just a survivor, but a signal, a soft, living protest against the cruelty of forgetting, against the speed with which society throws away anything that doesn't serve or shine. Mira wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her presence alone was a message. What we bury isn't always gone, and what we save isn't always broken. She wasn't there to teach anyone a lesson, but people learned anyway, about patience, about softness, about how healing never looks like it does in movies. It looks like a dog resting her head on your lap one day, when the week before, she couldn't even look you in the eye. And maybe that's what makes someone whole again. Not the absence of scars, but the freedom to carry them without shame. Not being fearless, but being safe enough to feel everything. That's what Mira had become, a quiet invitation to feel, not just for herself, but for the people who had long forgotten how. Evelyn once said that some wounds don't want to be fixed, they just want to be seen. And Mira, with every tentative blink, every careful step, every breath that no longer trembled, was proof that seeing was enough. Enough to begin. Enough to soften the world, even if only in inches. On her walks through the neighborhood, children would wave from porches and call her name. Not loudly, never loudly, but in the gentle tones they seemed to instinctively understand she needed. Elderly couples who had lost pets years ago found themselves kneeling in the grass, offering bits of biscuit in open palms, letting Mira approach them in her time, and she did. Sometimes it took 5 minutes, sometimes 15, but she always did, because this time she was allowed to choose. Every encounter, every stretch of sunlight she paused in, every soft corner she claimed as her own, chipped away at the memory of the place she had come from. And the pit, the one they had thrown her into, that silent grave made not just of dirt but of disregard, it began to feel like another lifetime. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer the only story she carried. There was a time when Mira couldn't sleep unless every light in the room was off and no shadows moved on the walls. But now she sometimes curled beside Evelyn's fireplace, eyes half-lidded, tail thumping lazily when someone said her name from across the room. She still flinched at sudden sounds, still cowered if shoes hit the floor too hard. But she stayed. She returned. She forgave. Not in words or gestures, but in the quiet persistence of choosing trust again and again and again. And Evelyn, well, she changed too. She stopped apologizing for taking up space in conversations about grief. She started attending community meetings again, speaking softly but clearly about what people discard and why. She carried Mira's photo in her wallet, not to boast, but to remind herself. Survival is not the end of the story. It's the start of a better one. Together they became a kind of soft rebellion against cruelty, against forgetting, against the lie that some lives are too broken to matter. And though Mira never spoke a word, her body told the entire tale. In the way she leaned into touch she once ran from. In the way she sat in the doorway when Evelyn left, not to stop her, but to say, "I'll be here when you come back." In the way she fell asleep with her face turned to the window, no longer needing to watch the door. She no longer existed in fear. She existed in hope. Not the loud cinematic kind that comes with swelling music or heroic rescues, but the kind that seeps in quietly, like sunlight through a window you forgot you left open. The kind of hope that doesn't demand anything, doesn't announce itself. It just waits, patiently, for you to notice it's still there. Mira began to embody that kind of hope, not just for Evelyn, but for every person who saw her and wondered if healing was still possible after being discarded, after being silenced, after being buried, literally or otherwise. Her presence became an anchor, the kind that didn't weigh people down, but held them steady. At the local shelter, new volunteers would ask about her, whispering as if they were speaking about something sacred. Evelyn sometimes brought her along during training sessions, not to perform, not to be paraded, but just to sit quietly in the corner, breathing. And somehow that silence did more than speeches ever could. It reminded people that not all wounds need to be visible to be real, that not every survivor wears their pain on the outside. Mira's story, told in glances and quiet company, began to spread. A woman who had once walked out of a shelter crying because she couldn't handle seeing the hurt came back with blankets she had sewn herself. A boy with anxiety who hadn't spoken to his classmates in weeks began to visit every Thursday just to sit near her, his hands resting on the floor beside her paws, his breathing finally syncing with hers. Mira didn't change the world, but she changed the room. And maybe that's how the world changes anyway. One room at a time, one heart, one moment, one life that refuses to disappear, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Evelyn would often say that people think healing is about fixing something broken, but healing, she said, is really about remembering that we were never broken to begin with, just forgotten, just overlooked, just unseen. And Mira, small, soft, silent Mira, had reminded everyone that even the most discarded life is still alive, still watching, still hoping, still worth everything, because in a world so quick to measure value by noise, by strength, by usefulness, Mira proved that worth could be quiet, that it could look like trembling paws on tile, like slow, deliberate steps across a hallway that once felt too wide, too open, too dangerous, that it could sound like breath, steady, slow, present, that it could feel like the warmth of a single hand resting gently behind an ear, not asking for anything, just being there. She didn't save lives in the way people expected. She wasn't the dog that ran into burning buildings or barked until someone was rescued. No one put a medal on her collar. She didn't make headlines, but she changed people, not with drama, with presence, with the unshakable truth that survival in itself is a form of resistance, that being soft in a world that tried to break you is the loudest rebellion of all. The world around her began to shift. Evelyn's home became a quiet refuge for more than just Mira. Fosters came and went, each of them broken in different ways, some loud and panicked, others silent like Mira had once been. But they watched her, they followed her, because even in her silence, Mira had become a leader. Not through force, but through endurance, through her choice to stay, her choice to trust again, her choice to exist fully and without apology. Children who had never been taught gentleness learned it at her feet. Volunteers who had been growing numb to cruelty remembered why they came. And Evelyn, who once thought her days of making a difference were behind her, found herself reborn. Through Mira, she didn't just remember the world's cruelty, she remembered its capacity to heal, to begin again, to hold space for stories that others would rather forget. Mira's bed sat in the corner of the living room, beneath a window that caught the morning light just right. And every morning, Evelyn would sit with her, tea in hand, and speak aloud whatever she felt that day, sometimes a memory, sometimes a worry, sometimes just silence. And Mira would listen, eyes soft, body still, heart open. Because she knew that sometimes listening was everything. The world hadn't changed. There were still pits, still shovels, still places where lives like hers were thrown away. But now there was also a woman who carried a scarred photograph in her purse and whispered, "You're not garbage," to every scared animal that passed through her door. There was a boy who spoke to his classmates again, starting with the words, "This dog. She's brave." There was a community that began asking, what if we looked before we buried? And there was Mira, still small, still quiet, but no longer invisible, no longer alone. And every time someone asked about her, Evelyn would say the same thing. She wasn't supposed to make it, but she did. And because she did, everything is different now. Not because the world suddenly became kind, or because people stopped doing harm, or because the systems that failed her no longer exist, but because one dog lived, one breath made it through, one hand reached down, just in time, and decided not to look away. And that shifted something. It wasn't immediate. Change never is. But like water carving stone, it began. Quiet, patient, relentless. Evelyn no longer walked through her town the same way. She noticed the signs, small, almost invisible signs that others missed. A backyard fence too high, a window always dark, the sound of barking that didn't match the rhythm of play. And she didn't ignore them. She knocked, she asked. Sometimes she just left a note. And more often than she expected, someone listened. Local shelters started keeping better records. One even launched a campaign called Breathe Like Mira, aimed at teaching people how to recognize the silent signs of neglect. Fearful eyes, quiet dogs, stillness that looks like obedience but is really shut down. Children who had once drawn superheroes began drawing Mira instead. Always small, always quiet, but always standing. And Evelyn's house? It became something of a myth. People said it smelled like chamomile and safety, that there was always a cup of tea brewing, that there were books stacked in the corners and soft beds for animals in every room. That if you walked in feeling broken, you'd leave with something you didn't have before. Not fixed, but seen. And that was enough. Sometimes Mira would sit by the door, her ears twitching at the wind, her eyes watching the birds flicker past the window. She didn't need to go anywhere. She had already traveled farther than most ever do. Not in miles, but in memory, in healing, in presence. She had gone from discarded to cherished, from buried to remembered, from feared to followed. Everything was different now, not because pain had disappeared, but because people had started noticing it, because one life refused to stay silent, because hope, however small, had survived long enough to plant roots in someone else's heart. There were still hard days. Evelyn sometimes woke up from dreams of the pit, of that cold earth and the breath she almost missed. But Mira would be there, curled beside her, breathing slowly like a reminder. We're here now. We made it. Keep going. And so they did, together. Not as a miracle, not as some tidy ending wrapped in hope and closure, but as a rhythm, a quiet daily rhythm of healing, slow, imperfect, and deeply alive. Evelyn no longer felt like she was simply caring for a rescued dog. She was walking beside a survivor, one who never asked for redemption, but offered it in her every breath. They woke up together, greeted the same soft morning light, walked the same paths through the neighborhood, where people now smiled not out of politeness, but recognition. Because Mira had become something more than a name. She was a symbol for those who'd been silenced, forgotten, shut down. Her story whispered through shelters, schools, social media posts. She made it, people would say. So can they. There were days Evelyn cried, without knowing why. Grief has a strange way of lingering in the corners, showing up in sunlight, in stillness, in the way Mira sometimes stared at the wall, as if remembering something she didn't want to recall. But there was no shame in it, only space. Space to feel, to remember, to breathe. And Mira didn't just heal, she taught healing, with every hesitant lean into an outstretched hand, with every nap taken in the middle of a room she used to avoid, with every tail wag, not fast or frantic, but slow and steady, like a metronome ticking out the beat of a life reclaimed. She began to mentor the new ones, the ones who arrived at Evelyn's door trembling, refusing food, sleeping with one eye open. They'd see Mira and stop, sniff, watch. And somehow, without barks, without commands, they followed her. She'd show them the safest corners, the best sunbeams, the quietest hours to approach a lap. She became the bridge they couldn't cross alone. And the community noticed, not in big announcements, but in the way people paused when they saw an animal alone on the street, in the way they slowed down to check yards, in the way more volunteers signed up, not because they had extra time, but because they couldn't not show up anymore. Everything had changed, not because of laws passed or systems fixed, but because of a dog who blinked, because someone dug gently instead of quickly, because one life refused to end where someone else had tried to write the final line. And from that refusal, 1,000 new stories began. And every night, as Evelyn turned off the last light and Mira curled into her bed, no longer watching the door, no longer waiting for the worst, there was a peace, not the kind that says, "We're done," but the kind that whispers, "We're doing it." Every day, every moment, choosing compassion, choosing presence, choosing life, together. There was no ceremony, no applause, no final scene where the world stood still in honor of what had been survived. But in Evelyn's living room, beneath a faded photograph of Mira's first day home, there was a warmth that hadn't been there before. Not just the warmth of blankets or sunlight, but the warmth of knowing that something had been restored. Mira didn't need to be remembered as a symbol. She simply wanted to exist without fear, to wake, stretch, and move through her day with the unspoken understanding that she was safe, she was wanted, and she was never going to be forgotten again. And that, more than anything, was her victory. Because not every life is saved in fire and noise. Some are saved in silence, in a hand that doesn't pull away, in eyes that finally see, in the choice to dig just a little deeper when everyone else has already walked away. Mira reminded the world of something we too often forget, that the smallest lives, the quietest ones, the ones tossed aside and nearly buried, they matter, they teach, they stay. And in doing so, they change everything. If Mira's story moved you, even just a little, don't let it end here. Every year, thousands of animals like her are thrown away, labeled broken, unworthy, or too far gone. But they're not. They're waiting, just like she was. Support your local shelters. Report suspected neglect, even when it's hard. Adopt, foster, volunteer. Be the hand that reaches down, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. Subscribe to this channel to help more stories like Mira's be heard. And if you've ever saved or been saved by an animal like her, share this story. Let the world remember. Let her matter. Together, we don't just rescue, we rebuild.